I was part of an island exploration team in the Indian Ocean. I was the only survivor, Part 2. Written by Blackwing16. I'm sorry about the delayed posts. Everything's been a little crazy lately. I had to be in solitary for a few days. I'll explain why at a later date, but let's get back to it. Before I get into the events that I last left on, let me give you some details about my fellow team members as well as the 4 crew members that I worked with on the Sea Dragon. Jim, Joe, and Ryan. These 3 were the team's primary marine biologist specialist. They all played for the university's rugby team and had very stocky, muscular builds. Jim was the tallest of the 3, as well as the most outgoing, and he had a face and hairstyle similar to that of Bradley Cooper in Limitless. You know, the slicked back look. Joe was slightly shorter than Jim, but still recognizably tall. He was a pretty shy kid and usually kept to himself if he wasn't talking with Ryan or Jim. He had black, buzzed hair and wore glasses that made him look like he could work part-time as a librarian. Ryan was my favorite of the 3. He was a very kind and polite person, but he was also funny. I remember thinking that if his marine biology studies didn't work out, he could always go into stand-up. He was the shortest of the 3 and had a sort of afro-typed hairstyle. All 3 of them had been best friends since high school when they first found their love of rugby and were very protective of each other. Next is Emily and Stephanie. These 2 were the team's botanists. They spent most of the voyage over discussing their excitement about discovering new plant life and possibly some species that could have medical properties. They were both noticeably pretty, the type of girls that everyone would stare at when they entered the room. Emily took part of the university's fishing team as well as their outdoor adventures club. She had a taste for the wild, so it didn't take her long to jump on the opportunity for this trip. Stephanie was about the same. She loved nature and the outdoors and was very active in them. However, aside from Emily, she was a huge nerd, which I found so attractive. She loved mythology, cryptic research, and things like that. She was so open-minded and always saw things different than most people. I loved that about her. Another noticeable quality of hers was that she had 2 different colored eyes. One was green and the other blue. It was infatuating. Next on the team were Miguel, Brent, and Craig. There really isn't much to say about these 3. They were all biochemists and didn't really socialize much on the voyage over. They were glued to their textbooks and journals. They seemed to take everything much more seriously than everyone else. I don't think that they were doing it for the adventure, but rather for the research and the discoveries they might make. And I respect that up to a point. They were all pretty scrawny and lanky. I just hoped that I never found myself in a situation where they had to defend me, because it looked as if a large gust of wind could sweep them off their skinny feet. Next on the team were Bert and John. These 2 were the leaders of the expedition and were both professors at the university. They were both in their 50s, but they were built like linebackers. They had been friends since grade school and had both served in the SEALs for a number of years before retiring to teach marine wildlife and topics similar to that. They were some of the nicest men I had ever met and were very respectable. At first glance, they were very intimidating with their large builds and thick beards. But once you struck up a conversation with them, they were so friendly and enthusiastic. I knew that we would be in good hands with them. Next is the crew. The crew that I worked with on maintaining and driving the Sea Dragon consisted of 4 members, not including myself. Their names were Marco, Callie, Helen, and Captain Nate. They were all very friendly and had been working in the industry for all of their lives. They told some of the most captivating stories about their past voyages. We all grew close on the long journey over as we worked around the boat. They taught me so much about the work needed to maintain a boat that was this large. Our jobs were mainly just making sure that all the systems were working, that the boat was clean, as well as watching after the engine, catching fish, and then cooking, and also taking the team on shore with the smaller powerboats. Okay, now that that's all out of the way, let me continue where I left off. My head was throbbing harshly as I ran to the stern of the boat where Jim had supposedly been grabbed. Emily was hysterical as she screamed that some monster had grabbed him and that he was probably dead. Callie tried to calm her down as Ryan and I searched the water from the boat. We couldn't see anything at first as the water was disturbed from Jim's fall, but it wasn't too long before we saw a large shadow near the surface. With a large splash and a gasp of air, Jim broke the surface of the water. "Woohoo! Did you guys see that?" he exclaimed excitedly. Ryan and I exchanged a look of concern as we walked to the back of the boat to help Jim aboard. "What are you smiling at?" Ryan shouted at Jim. "We thought you were dead or worse." "Dude, there is nothing to worry about. Nothing at all. If anything, we should be celebrating because I think we just discovered a new species of giant squid," he said with a large smile plastered on his face. "What are you talking about?" I asked him in confusion. At that moment, I noticed that the other powerboat was heading in our direction, most likely because of the commotion we had just created. As it neared our boat, a strange surge from underneath us ripped through the water. As it reached the other boat, its engine cut out. I saw Marco walk towards the back of the boat with a confused expression as he began inspecting the motor and the electrical systems. "Did you see that?" Jim said with an excited tone. "That was the squid. It's developed some sort of electrical discharge when it feels threatened. From what I can tell by what I saw when it pulled me in, we were right over its den. All it's doing is defending itself," he stated. I was in shock, no pun intended, but it made sense. After all, I did witness firsthand the discharge from the squid. After a short explanation to the other boat and some concerned conversation, the crew and I grabbed some oars and decided to paddle away from the den. We got about 100 feet away when our engines and electrical systems roared back to life. I looked over at Jim only to see a confident, slightly cocky look on his face. He knew that he was right, and we did too. After a short ride to the shore of the first island, we beached the boats and unloaded the team and whatever equipment they had. This island reminded me so much of the one that I had watched the sunset on not too long ago. The sand was the same bright white color and was fine-grained. I took my shoes off to feel it between my toes and was tempted to lie down on it. But we had work to do. The shore was lined with thick trees and vegetation, so simply walking through it wasn't an option. "All right, everyone, we are splitting up into two teams, one with me and one with John," Bert said as he unseated a large machete. As we split up, both team leaders began hacking at the vegetation and making a path for their followers. As we made our way into the forest, Emily and Stephanie were basically screaming about what they were seeing. Some of the vegetation that we cut through had thick vines with blossoming flowers housed on them. Apparently, they were unknown to science. So were the insects that were crawling all over them. They looked to be some sort of species of bee, but they were far more mesmerizing than your typical honeybee. They had red stripes running vertically down their bodies and what looked almost like gold plating on each leg. Their eyes were vibrant violet with yellow pupils. Emily kept trying to catch one in order to examine it, but failed. "Ow!" Emily exclaimed. I turned to see her gripping her forearm. "Are you okay?" Bert said as he turned from the front of the pack. "Yeah, it's nothing. It's just one of the little guys stung me, but it doesn't hurt anymore. Let's keep going," Emily said. We continued and quickly forgot about the sting. It was about an hour of walking and cutting through the thick jungle before we came to a large clearing, surrounded by woods. It was a strange sight. The trees that surrounded the clearing seemed very out of place, like they didn't belong in this climate. There were thick oak trees and dark pine spruces. Among them were a few dotted birchwood trees that had irregular patterns on them. "Have you ever seen anything like this before in a tropical island?" I asked the girls, confused. "No, but that's why we're here. To see things that we don't know anything about." to find something out of place and give it a place in a textbook," Stephanie said with a cute smile. I saw Bert sheath his machete and grab his radio from his side pocket. "Trekker to Scout, you guys okay?" he said in a serious tone. A few moments went by before John's static voice came through.
"Scout to Trekker. We are all good on this end. Just found what looks to be a popular watering hole for the animals here. Some strange deer are taking a nice dip right now. I've never seen anything like them,"
John said. "All right, let's regroup in 2 hours," Bert said as he lowered his radio to his side. We began exploring the clearing. There was a large open patch of grass that looked like it had been trampled by many large animals. There were a few large rock structures that seemed to be small caves that dotted the perimeter of the grass. Callie and I began to approach one of the small caves when the smell of rot erupted into our nostrils. We both choked back a few gags and shared a curious glance with one another. We continued into the mouth of the cave. Before I entered, I saw Emily and Stephanie do the same, with the cave about 50 feet to our right. As we entered, I had to use a small flashlight to illuminate the dark walls of the cave. The smell was getting stronger the deeper we went in. As we approached the dead end at the back of the cave, our flashlights barely illuminated what lay before us. Then I heard the familiar scream of Emily. Before turning around and booking it towards her voice, I took one quick look at the back of the cave. There were bones, flesh, and corpses everywhere. Blood was splattered across the walls. Entrails lay on the ground next to chunks of flesh. The worst part, however, was that some of the remains were human. There was a human skull, what looked to be a human femur, but the most gruesome was the head of what looked to be a Native American woman laying on a bed of rocks. I couldn't really process what I was seeing because before I knew it, I was at full sprint towards the mouth of the cave, Callie following at the same pace. We breached the cave and saw Bert holding Emily, who seemed very shaken up. I approached them and I asked what was wrong, holding back thoughts of what lay in the cave behind me. "There were bones, human bones, and human body parts," she shouted through her sobs. "I thought these islands were uninhabited," she said while looking up at Bert, who now had a worried expression on his face. Before he could speak, we heard the crunch of leaves and the rustling of the bushes that surrounded the clearing. Bert quickly reached for his pistol and quickly clicked off the safety. We all grouped up and had our backs turned towards each other, each of us fixating on the sounds that seemed to be coming from all around us. We stood there for what felt like hours trying to catch sight of what was surrounding us when something burst through the tree line. It was hideous and something that should not exist in this world. It stood on 4 legs and was a mix of black and red. The colors on its body seemed to pulse with a strange light, illuminating the colors even more. It was the size of a large cow, but resembled the body type of an apex, wolf-like predator. Each foot on its body had large, razor-sharp claws. Its tail was long and ended in a strange flap that looked to be spiked. It didn't have eyes. Where the eyes should have been was just more of the same pulsating skin. The worst of all was its mouth. Its head was about 3 feet long and was slit in the middle to reveal an abnormally large, long mouth. Its mouth was filled with razor-sharp teeth. The beast let out a growl. As it did so, more and more of the same creatures came into view. 2, then 3, then 7. Before I knew it, we were surrounded by 15 of these predators. They began to slowly approach us, teeth snarling at the ready, when a loud, blood-curdling roar tore through the air. The source of the roar was not visible, but it sounded to be just behind the tree line. After a few seconds had passed, the creatures began to retreat into the woods, howling and growling in an unnaturally deep tone. After the last creature had gone from sight, Bert grabbed all of us and told us to run back to the shore. I didn't know that my legs could run so fast. Nor did I know how fast a group of people could be in a situation such as that. I guess that fear is quite the motivator. We made it back to the beach shortly after that, all of us gasping for air, and some of us collapsing into the soft sand below. "Trekker to Scout, come in now," Bert said in an out-of-breath and worried tone. Static erupted through his radio for a few seconds, and then we heard the sound of John and his team. It sounded as if they were running, fast.
"Ready the boats and get ready to leave,"
John shouted through the radio. With no words exchanged back, Callie and I ran over to the two powerboats and began to push them into the wavy surf. I loaded up the rest of my team on the boat while Callie waited for the others. It was a few minutes later when they came into sight. John was holding Joe in his arms, blood covering his shirt. "We have to leave now. Get the boats and get some pressure on that bite," said John as he barked out orders. "John," Bert exclaimed, "where's Craig?" "They got him, tore him to pieces in the water and splattered him up on the rocks. We are not the only things here," John shouted as he helped the rest of the team onto the boat. Well, that's all I have for now. I'm being watched pretty closely after my last incident, so I will update you when I can. Take care.